Thank you all for coming. I'm going to begin by introducing Jordan Peterson, and then I will talk a little bit about how this event is going to work, and then we'll get underway. So Jordan Peterson has been called, quote, one of the most important thinkers to emerge on the world stage for many years by The Spectator. He has been a dishwasher, gas jockey, bartender, short order cook, beekeeper, oil derrick bit retipper, plywood mill laborer, and railway line worker. He's taught mythology to lawyers, doctors, and businessmen, consulted for the UN Secretary General's high-level panel on sustainable development, helped his clinical clients manage depression, obsessive-compulsive disorder, anxiety, and schizophrenia, served as an advisor to senior partners of major law firms, identified thousands of promising entrepreneurs on 6 different continents, and lectured extensively in North America and Europe. He has flown a hammerhead roll in a carbon fiber stunt plane, piloted a mahogany racing sailboat around Alcatraz Island, explored an Arizona meteorite crater with a group of astronauts, built a Native American longhouse on the upper floor of his Toronto home, and been inducted into the Coastal Pacific Kwakwaka'wakw tribe. Malcolm Gladwell discussed psychology with him while researching his books. Norman Doidge is a good friend and collaborator. Thriller writer Greg Hurwitz employed several of his, quote, valuable things as a plot feature in his #1 international bestseller, Orphan X. And he worked with Jim Balsillie, former RIM CEO, on a project for the UN Secretary General. With his students and colleagues, Dr. Peterson has published more than 100 scientific papers, transforming the modern understanding of personality, and revolutionized the psychology of religion with his now classic book, Maps of Meaning, The Architecture of Belief. As a Harvard professor, he was nominated for the prestigious Levinson Teaching Prize and is regarded by his current University of Toronto students as one of 3 truly life-changing teachers. Dr. Peterson is a Quora most viewed writer in values and principles and parenting and education. He has innumerable Twitter followers and Facebook followers. His YouTube channel now has about 1 million subscribers. And his classroom lectures on mythology were turned into a popular 13-part TV series on TV Ontario. Dr. Peterson's online self-help program, the Self-Authoring Suite, has been featured in Oh, the Oprah Magazine, on CBC Radio, and on NPR's national website. It has helped over 150,000 people resolve the problems of their past and radically improve their future. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Jordan Peterson to Lafayette College. So the way this is going to work is that I'm going to have a conversation with Dr. Peterson for 90 minutes, and then there is going to be a 90-minute Q&A. This event is being video recorded and will be published online for non-commercial, non-advertising purposes. During the Q&A session, when you are handed a microphone, please speak directly into it. Our viewers on YouTube will appreciate it. And finally, I am a moderator between Professor Peterson and the audience, but also a biased participant in this conversation. Okay.
Well, it's a relief that's all over.
Okay, so I thought we would start things off with this. I assume that many in the audience are curious but relatively unfamiliar with you, or have heard a lot about you without ever reading or listening to you. So I thought we might start with you introducing yourself to the audience and maybe telling them some of the main things that you think they might be interested in knowing about you.
Well, I guess the most relevant detail is that I spent about 15 years writing this, and I worked on it about 3 hours a day, every day during that period of time. And at the same time, I was finishing off my doctorate, and I started lecturing at Harvard, but I was doing that continually and thinking about it continually and reading the material that I needed to read in order to write the book continually as well. And I didn't realize until more recently that what I was doing was at the heart of the postmodern conundrum, I would say. I was very much obsessed by the events of the Cold War for reasons I don't exactly understand. I had a lot of dreams about nuclear annihilation for years on end. I mean, it wasn't that uncommon to be obsessed by that when I grew up. I mean, because it was a preoccupation of everyone who was my age, I suppose. There were lots of years, probably between 1962, I would say, probably in 1985, where people were pretty convinced that the probability of a nuclear war was high, much higher now than people consider now. And I was curious about this. I was curious about why everyone wasn't obsessed about this all the time, first of all, because it seemed like the fundamental issue that two armed camps were pointing something in excess of 25,000 hydrogen bombs each at each other. I couldn't understand how anybody could concentrate on anything other than that, since it seemed so utterly insane. And I was curious, what was going on exactly? Was this, one explanation was that there's a very large number of ways that human beings could organize themselves in society, like a large number of games that we could hypothetically play, and they're all equally arbitrary in an equally arbitrary universe, and that the communists had decided to play one kind of game, and the West and the Western free market democratic types had decided to play another game, and it was all arbitrary in some sense. And so that's what I was trying to figure out, was what the hell was going on with this conflict, and was it merely a battle between two hypothetically equally valid interpretations of the world drawn from a set of extraordinarily large potential interpretations, which I think would be essentially a postmodernist take on it. And I think I went into the problem neutrally, in that I didn't think I knew what the answer was. You know, so lots of times when you talk to people who think, or when you talk to people who write, they have an idea and it's right, and then they write whatever they're writing to justify the idea. That's how they look at it. But it's not a good way to write. A good way to write and think is to have a problem and then try to solve it, right? To actually solve it, not to demonstrate that your a priori commitment is true. And, you know, one of the signs, I would say, that my a priori commitments weren't the purpose for the writing was that I walked away from that 15-year project with a view of the world that was completely different than the view that I had going in, and learned all sorts of things, especially about the role of narrative and religious thinking in life that I had no idea was possible when I started. And a lot of that was a consequence of reading the great people who I read deeply. You know, I read, well, all the great works of Friedrich Nietzsche and the great works of Dostoevsky and Tolstoy and most of Jung's collected works, everything that had been published up to that point, and a very large swath of the relevant clinical literature, the great clinicians of the 20th century, and a huge stack of neuroscience, and et cetera, because I was reading constantly during this time. And I realized some things that I think are true. The communists were wrong. They weren't, and not just a little bit wrong, and not wrong in some arbitrary way. They were playing a game that human beings cannot play without descending into a murderous catastrophe. And there's something about what we've done in the West that's correct. And it's hard, it's complicated, because our cognitive structures, that's one way of thinking about it, or our socio-political arrangements, they actually parallel one another in an important way, are grounded in a strange set of axioms. And the axioms aren't rational precisely. It's more like their narrative. They're narrative axioms. They're stories. And the story of the West is that the individual is sovereign over the group, and that that's the solution to tribalism. And I think that's the correct solution. Now, what that means metaphysically, because it's also embedded in our religious doctrines, right? Because especially in Christianity, although not exclusively to Christianity, the individual is sovereign. The suffering individual is sovereign. And there's something about that that's true, at least psychologically. And I don't know what that might mean metaphysically, because who the hell knows what anything means metaphysically, right? I mean, your knowledge runs out, right, at some point. Anyways, I worked all these ideas out, and then I taught for a long time courses that were based on the ideas, and the courses were very impactful, I would say. They had the same impact on the people that I was teaching as walking through the material had on me. And well, it was out of that all of this political controversy arose. I mean, I was never focused on political controversy, even though I'm interested in politics, and I thought at many points in my life about a political career. I always put it aside for a psychological and philosophical career, I would say. And but things started to shift badly in Canada over the last 5 years, and our government dared to implement legislation that compelled speech. And one of the things that I had learned when I was doing all this background investigation was that there isn't a higher value than free speech. It isn't free speech. It's not the right way of thinking about it, because it's free thought. And even that's not the right way of thinking about it, because thought is the precursor to action and life. So there's no difference between free speech and free life. And I was just not willing to put up with restrictions on my free life. And so I made some videos pointing out the pathology of this doctrine and the fact that the government had radically overreached its appropriate limits. And well, then, you know, well, and maybe you don't know, but I've been enveloped in continual scandal for 18 months as a consequence, which to me, as a clinician, indicates that I got my damn diagnosis right. Right? It's not about pronouns. It's about something a lot deeper than that. And I stand by that. I believe that it's the case. And I don't think that we would all be here tonight if that wasn't the situation.
So I wanted my first, or my next question to be about Lafayette. And so I thought I would read a couple of Facebook posts that certain students who are critical of you read in the lead up to this event, and just ask you to respond to them.
Okay.
So this is a student writing, Lafayette College, I am utterly disappointed that you're allowing this to take place on our campus. I thought we went through this last semester with Roaming Millennial. Inviting hateful speakers who make wildly unsubstantiated claims is not going to fly with the student body. I get it. The Mill Series events are private and not endorsed by the college, but you absolutely have the power to make a statement on this. The fact that you're not is an embarrassment to our community. If you believe this man is a legitimate source of knowledge because he has a degree in clinical psychology, feel free to ask our psychology department faculty and counseling center staff about the validity of his claims. I'm certain they would not endorse this speaker. Do better, in all caps. For those of you unfamiliar, Jordan Peterson is known for denouncing the Me Too movement, claiming that women are in no way marginalized in the West, arguing against the existence of gender-neutral pronouns, arguing against gun control in the US, and claiming that identity politics and social justice movements are part of a devious Marxist agenda. And then another student responded, and this is briefer. College conservatives know that if they bring in a speaker who is willing to blatantly insult a portion of the audience, and the libs get angry enough about this for good reason, then they may get an op-ed written about them in the New York Times. As a result, there are a whole group of hacks, like Milo and Peterson, who get famous and invited purely for their promise to misgender trans students and advocate provocative but ultimately toothless arguments about social Darwinist race theory. What I'm saying is that you have every right to be pissed. Jordan Peterson is a harmful moron, but know that you being pissed is also 100% of the point of why he was invited. He's not a conservative. He's just a guy who's mildly racist enough to offend college liberals and therefore secure wins for the cultural right.
Comparatively mild stuff. It's the chattering buzz of ideologically possessed demons. So there's nothing in it that's not entirely predictable. That's one of the things you notice when you're talking to people. If you want to find out whether the person is there or the ideology is there, you listen to see if you're hearing anything that someone else of the same ideological mindset couldn't have told you. You know, like I've had thousands of conversations with people because I've spent 20 years as a clinical psychologist, and one of the things I've learned about people is that they're unbelievably interesting. If you get someone to sit down and you move past the superficial, which you can actually do quite rapidly, they'll tell you all sorts of things that only they know, that are unbelievably enlightening about their own peculiar problems, about the way they look at the world, about their idiosyncratic familial dynamics, like just fascinating personal stuff. It's the stuff of great novels, you know, and this is ordinary people. I don't really think there is an ordinary person exactly. There's the facade of ordinariness, but behind that, people are very rarely ordinary. And so the conversations are almost instantaneously fascinating. And one of the guidelines that I used in my clinical practice constantly was, like, I had this sense, I probably learned this mostly from Carl Rogers, was that if the conversation wasn't really interesting, then we weren't doing anything that was therapeutically useful. But all of the interesting elements of it were very, very personal. And so to replace this, and I learned this mostly from Alexander Solzhenitsyn in his detailed analysis of what I would call ideological possession, he talked about people he met in the Gulag camps who were under the sway of rigid communist orthodoxy, and noted very clearly that it was like there was a crank in some sense on the side of their head, and you could just crank the crank and out would come the ideological dogma, and it's all entirely predictable. And people who are in a situation like that don't understand that they're possessed by an idea, right? As Carl Jung said, people don't have ideas, ideas have people. And it's like, so there's nothing in that that's anything other than exactly what you would predict. And then there's a deeper issue too, and this is one that I think has bedeviled me ever since I made my initial videos, which is it's impossible for those on the radical left to admit that anyone who opposes what they're doing might be reasonable, because what that would mean would be that you could be reasonable and oppose the radical left, and that would imply that what the radical left was doing wasn't reasonable. And so instead of dealing with the fact that I actually happen to be quite reasonable, the attempt is to assume that anyone who objects must be part of the radical right. It's like, well, actually, no. There's lots of space between the radical left and the radical right. There's the moderate, reasonable left, for example, and then there's the center, and then there's the moderate, reasonable right, and then there's the far right, and then there's the extreme right. All of that exists in opposition to the radical left, but it's very convenient for the radicals on the left to say, oh well, you don't buy our doctrine, and then to immediately make the presupposition that you must be the most heinous example of that entire array of potential objection. It's like, yeah, well, whatever, you know, it's just not a viable stance. And so, but it's convenient, and it's a bad thing because it drives polarization, and that's a bad thing. But it doesn't address the issue. So one of the things that I've been thinking about deeply over the last couple of weeks and plan to write about, here's a mystery for all of you. I don't care what your political background is, and it isn't like I'm anti-left. I've made videos documenting this. I know why there's a left wing. There's a left wing because inequality is a problem. It's a way worse problem than the radical leftists like to admit, because you can't lay it at the feet of capitalism and the free market. Inequality is a way worse problem than that. But it's definitely a problem. And because inequality is a problem, you need part of the political structure to speak up for the people who end up arrayed at the bottom of hierarchies. It's crucial. Someone has to speak for them. That's the place of the left. But then consider this. So we can state that. The right speaks for hierarchy and the left speaks on behalf of those who are oppressed by inequality. Good. We need that dialogue. The radical left. Okay. We know from 20th century history that things can go too far on the right, no one disputes that, and that things can go too far on the left. And we also know that when things go too far, it's seriously not good, right? So when things went too far on the right, then we had 120 million people die in the Second World War. And when things went too far on the left, we had God only knows how many people murdered as a consequence of internal repression, at least 100 million. And we risked putting the entire planet, we risked putting the planet into flames. Okay, so that's the consequence. All right, so now in the aftermath of World War II, let's say we've come to some sort of sociological agreement, I would say, that you can identify the radical right-wingers. When people make claims of racial superiority, you put them in a box and you say, well, you're outside of acceptable political discourse. And so you saw that with William F. Buckley in the 60s when he started his conservative review. He dissociated himself from the David Duke types, and you saw it more recently with people, for example, like Ben Shapiro, who immediately distanced himself from the Charlottesville types. Okay, so now we kind of have a sense of where you've crossed the damn line in your ethno-nationalism, right? As soon as you move into the racial superiority domain, ethnic superiority domain, it's like, no, you've got to be dangerous. All right, here's a question. Where the hell do you cross the line on the left? Exactly. Well, the answer is who knows? Well, that's not a very good answer. I would say it's incumbent on people in the center and in the moderate left to say, look, things can go too far on the left, and here's how we know that's happened. And that hasn't happened at all. Now, I think there's a reason for that. I think there's a technical reason as well as a motivational reason. Two technical reasons. It's harder for people on the left to draw boundaries because people on the left aren't boundary drawing types. They're boundary dissolving types, temperamentally speaking. So that's a problem. The second problem is it doesn't look to me like there is a smoking pistol on the left that's as obvious as racial superiority doctrines. You know, it's like in Canada there's a lot of push for this triumvirate of radical ideas: diversity, inclusivity, and equity. Which diversity, it's like, well, who's against that? It's like being against poverty. Inclusivity, well, yes, of course we want people included. Equity, that's a more bitter pill to swallow because that's equality of outcome, and for me that's a marker. It's like if you're talking about equality of outcome, you've gone too far. And if you're talking about diversity, inclusivity, and equality of outcome, equity, then you've gone too far. And you might disagree. You might disagree. That's fine. Disagree. If that isn't the marker for going too far, then what's the marker? Because obviously you can go too far, and obviously that's not good. And to close on that, I would also say to the people on the moderate left, if you want your doctrines to have purchase and to continue to speak for those who stack up at the bottom of inevitable hierarchies, then you owe it to yourself to dissociate yourself from the dangerous radicals, because otherwise they invalidate your ideas. And that doesn't seem to be, you'd think the Democrats might have learned that in the last election, but they haven't. They haven't learned that. So, well, so that's my spiel about those comments, I guess.
Okay, so you've changed the lives of many young people and adults in this country, in the Anglosphere, in the West, in the world. You have a massive following. My girlfriend's parents call you Uncle Jordan, for example. On the other hand, and this is just a fact, tons of people on the left, as we've just seen, because of your power and also your frontal attack on a lot of their views, hate you and viciously caricature you. Then there are these other figures, like Jonathan Haidt and Robbie George. They have a lot in common with you. They are respected academics. They are at least relatively well-known outside academia. They share your critiques of the humanities, of student activists, of trends in Western culture. They don't have nearly the following that you do, but they also aren't as hated or viciously caricatured. Moreover, they may have changed the minds of more people on college campuses. That is, people on campuses who have some sympathy for left activists, or who may agree with much of what you say but react negatively to confrontation and harsh criticism. Haidt has appealed to such individuals by taking the Dale Carnegie win friends and influence people approach. So my questions are, first, do you agree with this dichotomy? Second, did you consciously choose one path over the other, and if so, why?
Well, I mean, with Haidt, for example, there's more power to him as far as I'm concerned. You know, he has a different temperament than me. He's more introverted. He's less volatile, I would say. He's probably more agreeable, or more polite anyways. And I think that what he's doing is extremely effective, especially from the perspective of very carefully documenting the empirical facts about the ideological, the increasingly left-leaning ideological tilt of campuses, which is something that needs to be explored on empirical grounds. So like I said, more power to him, and there's nothing wrong with being reasonable, I guess. And then you asked, well, is that the right pathway for me? It's like, well, apparently not. What happened when I made my initial videos was that, you know, I'd talked to people a lot. I've worked with people a lot about negotiation. It's one of the things that I specialized in, I would say, in my clinical and consulting practice, was teaching people how to negotiate. And I can tell you some things about negotiating that you might find interesting and useful. The first is, you can't negotiate from a position of weakness. So all of you who are going to be developing your careers in the future, you need to understand that if you want to push your career forward, well, first of all, that you do in fact have to push it forward, because if you're competent and silent, you will be ignored. And you know, that's rough, because you might think, well, people should reward you because you're competent, and yes, of course they should, but if you're competent and silent, then you're not a problem. You're just part of the background that's keeping everything functioning. And so if you want to develop your career in terms of promotion, say, and salary, is like, you have to be competent and you have to be strategic. And to be strategic, when you negotiate for a new position or for a new salary, you have to be able to say, if you don't give me what I want, then something you don't like will happen to you. And what that means, it's not a physical threat, it's that you have an option. You know, so you have your CV, your resume in order, right? You're educated and competent and desirable to people outside of your immediate job. You're willing to instantly put yourself in the job market and undergo the stress of finding a new position and undergoing interviews and all of that. And you have that all planned out, so that when you go talk to the person that you're negotiating with regards to your salary, you're credible. And you see, because it's very seldom that you're talking to the person who's at the top of the pecking order, let's say. What you need to do with them is to tell them a story that they can tell to their boss to make you not a problem. And a good story is, look, we really need this person because they're hyper competent and they have a better offer. It's like, well, then you're going to win the negotiation. But if you go in there with no power, well, you're going to lose, obviously. So the first thing that you need to know if you're going to negotiate is that you have to be able to say no. And what no means is that you're not going to do it. And when I made the videos about Bill C-16, I thought it through. And I thought, there's no damn way I'm following this law. I don't care what happens. And I didn't say that lightly. I thought it through. I thought, okay, well, let's assume the worst case scenario, and the worst case scenario would be that a student would report me to the Ontario Human Rights Commission, and then they would do an investigation. Then they would find me guilty, because the Ontario Human Rights Commission finds 99% of the people brought to it guilty, because that's what totalitarians do. And then I would refuse to pay the fine or cooperate with whatever the re-education they would put me through would be, and then that would move to civil court, and then I would be fined for contempt, and then it would, you know, then the whole legal catastrophe would unfold. And I thought, well, I could either do that, or I could allow the government to regulate my speech. It's like, nope, that's not happening. So you might think about that as confrontational, and it is confrontational. It's like, there isn't a goddamn thing that can be done to me to make me allow the government to compel my speech. That's not happening. And the reason for that, I believe the reason for that, is because I spent decades studying totalitarianism. It's not good. And the way that totalitarian states develop is that people give up their right to be, their right to exist with their own thoughts. They lie. That's what happens, is that individuals sacrifice their own souls to the dictates of the state. And then everything goes badly sideways. It's like, and you think, well, how much evidence for that do we need? You know, you're looking at 250 million deaths. It's like, isn't that enough? Well, the people that I read who were profound, Viktor Frankl's a good example for beginners. If you want to read about this sort of thing, he wrote a book called Man's Search for Meaning. And Frankl, and also Solzhenitsyn, and a variety of other commentators as well, who really looked into what happened in both in Nazi Germany and in the communist states. Their conclusion was universal, is that the lies of the state, the lies and tyranny of the state, are aided and abetted by the moral sacrifice of the individual. It's not top down. The Nazis are telling you what to do and you're all innocent and obeying. That's not how it works. Is you falsify your being bit by bit, and you end up where you don't want to be, and that's a bad idea. And if you're interested in that, there's a great book called Ordinary Men. You read that and you won't be the same person afterwards, so I would beware of reading it. But it's a story about these policemen in Germany. So they were middle-aged guys, you know, and they grew up and were socialized before the Nazis came to power. So they were just your typical middle-class policemen. And they were brought into Poland after the Nazis had marched through, and charged with keeping order in the occupied state. And they knew, their commander knew that it was going to be brutal, because they were in wartime, and they regard the Jews, for example, as enemies, and so there was going to be a fair bit of rounding up with all of that, with all of what that implied. And the commander told the policemen that they could go home if they wanted to, that they didn't have to participate in this. And then what Ordinary Men does is document their transformation from ordinary policemen, the sort of people that you know, to guys who were taking naked pregnant women out into the middle of fields and shooting them in the back of the head. And it documents one step at a time how an ordinary person turns into someone like that. You think, well, we don't want that sort of thing to happen anymore. Well, then you don't want to be that sort of person. That's how it's fixed. And if you're not going to be that sort of person, then you don't take the first steps, because the first steps lead you down a pathway that, at least in principle, you don't want to go. So, well, I think part of what makes me combative, say, compared to someone like Haidt, is that I've spent years looking at the worst things there are to look at. And I've learned from that, and I've certainly learned things that I won't do. And one of them is, I won't let the government regulate my speech. It's a mistake. I don't care what compassionate principles hypothetically motivate that move. It was unprecedented in English common law, that move. And it was all buried under this leftist compassion, which is mostly a lie. So I have reasons, I think, other than those that motivate someone like Jonathan Haidt to be particularly passionate about this issue.
So, on the subject of totalitarianism, I wanted to do something very quickly. So, I'm guessing that even though most people in the room have negative views of both men, they have a more intensely negative view of Hitler than of Stalin. I'm guessing almost everyone in the room has a far more negative visceral reaction to the swastika than to the hammer and sickle. Some of the protesters at your event at McMaster University stood behind a banner with a hammer and sickle. You've said that a hammer and sickle is no funnier than a swastika. That, quote, the reprehensible ideologies that are based in fundamental Marxism killed at least 100 million people in the 20th century, unquote. I've discussed this proposition with numerous people in recent months, and almost no one seems to buy it. No one disputes the body count under socialist regimes. Few dispute that Stalin was a vicious murderer, roughly on par with Hitler in moral terms. Most think that communism should not be tried again. In other words, they share your critique of the argument that previous communist experiments did not represent proper communism and that proper communism should be tried. Nevertheless, they still disagree with you that we should react as negatively to the hammer and sickle as we do to the swastika. Why? Because they say the two ideologies are not morally comparable. National Socialism is much worse morally than Marxism or Marxism-Leninism. So what do you say to this?
Well, I would say the first thing is that it's highly probable that you were talking to intellectuals.
Students.
Well, we'll call them budding intellectuals. It is a mystery, you know. It is a mystery, because it is the case that there is something about the Nazi doctrine that seems to have a visceral impact that the communist doctrine doesn't have. And I said when I opened my remarks tonight that it might be the issue of racial superiority. You know, it's something single that you can put your finger on. Whereas what's happening on the left that's horrifying is murky. It might even be multidimensional. Like maybe there isn't a single radical leftist idea that's murderous like the racial superiority doctrine. Maybe it's a combination of 3, or maybe it's some set of 4 out of 10. Who knows? So, and because of that, it doesn't seem as repugnant. And there was also a universalizing tendency among the communists that seemed to be less morally reprehensible than the ethno-nationalism of the Nazis. So, you know, you think, if you go back to 1914, it's complicated, but if you go back to, say, 1918, at the time of the Russian Revolution, it's not like the communists knew that their attempts to bring about the socialist utopia would be doomed to absolute murderous catastrophe, right? They were working in ignorance. Now, it's not that simple, because by that time Dostoevsky had already written The Devils, The Possessed, and he outlined very, very clearly what he thought would happen if people like that got the reins of power. And Nietzsche had done the same thing in his writing. So people knew that there was something toxic, let's say, and deadly about the doctrine. But it hadn't been played out on the world stage. But now, it's like, well, this is why I said what I said at the beginning. Fine. You know, if I don't know exactly how to make the moral distinction, but it's a distinction that has to be made. I think that people who apologize, who say something like, I think that it's virtually, I don't know if it's as reprehensible to say that a given ethnic group should be consigned to the fire and to say that wasn't real communism, but they're damn close. And when I hear someone say that wasn't real communism, I know what they mean. What they mean was, if I was the dictator in Stalin's shoes, I personally would have brought in the utopia. That's what that statement means. And, or it means an ignorance of history that's so utterly appalling that, that any political statement made on behalf of that person whatsoever should immediately be followed by a paroxysm of extreme embarrassment.
May I say one, just, I just want to be clear that these students were conceding that they don't agree. They share your critique of
they don't share it enough.
Oh, okay, fair enough. I just wanted to make that clear. But so they would more or less agree with what you just said, I think, about it's not okay to say those regimes weren't proper communism and that proper communism should be tried. They still dispute, though, that socialism as an ideology is on par with Nazism. So I just wanted to make that
clear.
We
could say communism, let's say. We could say radical leftist ideology. As I said already, there are reasons for the left and the right wing, right? The right wing stands for hierarchy and the left wing stands for those who are displaced by hierarchy, right? An endless problem. But that doesn't mean, that still leaves it in the camp of the people speaking on behalf of egalitarianism to figure out just what the no interventions work. And believe me, psychologists have tried everything you could possibly imagine and a bunch of things that you can't in order to ameliorate that. So we were really interested in trying to understand, for example, if you're antisocial by the age of 4, then there isn't an intervention that seems to be effective. So, and the standard penological theory is really quite horrifying in this regard, because what you see is that male aggression peaks around the age of 15 and then it declines fairly precipitously and sort of normalizes again by the age of 27. And standard penological theory essentially is this cold-hearted. It's like if you have someone who's a multiple offender, you just throw them in prison until they're 27. Then they age out of it. And that's all there is to it. That's what we've got. Now there's some downside to that, because there's a corollary literature that suggests that the worst thing that you can do with antisocial people is to group them together, which is what we do in prisons. So that's a whole mess. Anyways, one of the things we were doing was trying to see if there might be cognitive predictors of antisocial behavior. And so we used this battery of neuropsychological tests that was put together at the Montreal Neurological Institute. It took about 11 hours to administer and hypothetically assessed prefrontal cortical function. And we computerized that, reduced it to about 90 minutes, and then assessed antisocial adolescents in Montreal, and found out that they did show deficits in problem solving ability that we associated with prefrontal ability. When I got to Harvard, I thought, well, that's interesting. We could use the neuropsych battery to predict negative behavior. Perhaps we could use it to predict positive behavior. So I thought, well, what if we turned the neuropsych battery over and thought, well, can we predict grades, for example? Because that's a decent thing to predict. So we ran a study that looked at Harvard kids, University of Toronto kids, line workers at a Milwaukee factory, and managers and executives at the same factory. And what we found was that the average score across these neuropsychological tests, they were kind of like games. They were game-like, So in one test, there were 5 lights in the middle of the screen, and a box was associated with each light, and you had to learn by trial and error which box was associated with each light. That was one of the tests. So we took people's average score across the tests, because they seemed to clump together into a single structure. You can find that out statistically. If you take a bunch of tests, you can find out how they clump together statistically by looking at their patterns of correlations. And you might get multiple clumps, which is what happens with personality research, where you get 5, or you might get a singular clump, which is what happens in cognitive research. And we got a single clump, essentially. And then we were trying to figure out if, at the same time, I was reading the literature on performance prediction. And there's an extensive literature on performance prediction, a lot of it generated by the armed forces, by the way, indicating that IQ is a very good predictor of long-term life success. And so here's the general rule. If your job is simple, which means you do the same thing every day, then IQ predicts how fast you'll learn the job, but not how well you do it. But if your job is complex, which means that the demands change on an ongoing basis, then the best predictor of success is general cognitive ability. And I learned that the general cognitive ability tests clump together into a single factor. That's fluid intelligence, or IQ. And then we didn't know if the factor that we had found was the same factor as IQ. And we still haven't really figured out whether or not that was the case, because it kind of depends on how you do the analysis. But anyways, I got deeply into the performance prediction literature, and I found out, well, if you wanted to predict people's performance in life, there's a couple of things you need to know. You need to know their general cognitive ability if they're going to do a complex job. You need to know their trait conscientiousness. Some of you might have heard that rebranded as grit in a very corrupt act, by the way, because it's a good predictor of long-term life success. Freedom from negative emotion, low neuroticism, is another predictor, but it's sort of third on the hierarchy. And then openness to experience, which is a personality trait, is associated with expertise in creative domains. The evidence that, now I should tell you, since it's such a complicated question, I should tell you how to make an IQ test, because it's actually really easy, and you need to know this to actually understand what IQ is. So imagine that you generated a set of 10,000 questions, okay, about anything. They could be math problems, they could be general knowledge, they could be vocabulary, they could be multiple choice. It really doesn't matter what they're about as long as they require abstraction to solve. So they'd be formulated linguistically, but mathematically would also apply. And then you have those 10,000 questions. Now you take a random set of 100 of those questions and you give them to 1,000 people, and all you do is sum up the answers, right? So some people are going to get most of them right, and some of them are going to get most of them wrong. You just rank order the people in terms of their score. Correct that for age and you have IQ. That's all there is to it. And what you'll find is that no matter which random set of 100 questions you take, the people at the top of one random set will be at the top of all the others, and with very, very, very high consistency. So one thing you need to know is that if any social science claims whatsoever are correct, then the IQ claims are correct, because the IQ claims are more psychometrically rigorous than any other phenomenon that's been discovered by social scientists. Now the IQ literature is a dismal literature. No one likes it. Here's why. Here's an example. So here's a fun little fact for you, for liberals and conservatives alike, because conservatives think there's a job for everyone if people just get off their asses and get to work, and liberals think, well, you can train anyone to do anything. It's like, no, there isn't a job for everyone, and no, you can't train everyone to do everything. That's wrong. And here's one of the consequences of that. So as I mentioned, the Armed Forces has done a lot of work on IQ, and they started back in 1919, and the reason they did that was because, well, for obvious reasons, let's say there's a war and you want to get qualified people into the officer positions as rapidly as possible, or you'll lose. So that's a reason. Now the Armed Forces has experimented with IQ tests since 1919, and in the last 20 years a law was passed as a consequence of that analysis, which was that it was illegal to induct anyone into the Armed Forces who had an IQ of less than 83. Now the question is why? And the answer was, all of that effort put in by the Armed Forces indicated that if you had an IQ of 83 or less, there wasn't anything that you could be trained to do in the military that wasn't positively counterproductive. Now you got to think about that, because the military is chronically desperate for people, right? It's not like people are lining up to be inducted, right? They have to go out and recruit, and it's not easy, and so they're desperate to get their hands on every body they can possibly manage. And then, especially in wartime, but also in peacetime. But then there was another reason too, which was the Armed Forces was also set up from a policy perspective to take people in the underclass, let's say, and train them and move them up at least into the working class or maybe the middle class. So there's a policy element to it too. And so even from that perspective, you could see that the military is desperate to bring people in. But with an IQ of 83 or less, it's not happening. Okay, so how many people have an IQ of 83 or less? 10%. Now, if that doesn't hurt you to hear, then you didn't hear it properly. Because what it implies is that in a complex society like ours, and one that's becoming increasingly complex, there isn't anything for 10% of the population to do. All right, well, what are we going to do? Are we going to ignore that? We're going to run away from that? And believe me, we have every reason to. Or we're going to contend with the fact that we need to figure out how it might be possible to find a place for people on the lower end of the general cognitive distribution to take their productive and worthwhile place in society. And that isn't just going to be a matter of dumping money down the hierarchy, because giving people who have nothing to do money isn't helpful. It doesn't work. It's not that simple. Well, so that's kind of an answer to the question of whether or not we should deal with IQ forthrightly. It's like, if you can find a flaw in that logic, like, just go right ahead. It's not like I was thrilled to death to discover all of this. By no stretch of the imagination was that the case. So what? So IQ is reliable and valid. That's the first thing. It's more reliable and valid than any other psychometric test ever designed by social scientists by a factor of about 3. That's fact number 1. Fact number 2 is it predicts long-term life outcome at about 0.3, 0.4, which leaves about 85%, 70 to 85% of the story unexplained, but it's still the best thing that we have. Well, it's also the case that in places like Great Britain, when IQ tests were first introduced, they were actually used by the socialists, and they were used to identify poor people who had potential, cognitive potential, and to move them into institutes of higher education. So there's an upside, you know, a social upside as well. Ethnic differences. This is something you can't say anything about without immediately being killed. So I'm hesitant to broach the topic. But I'll tell you one thing that I did in the last week that's relevant to this. And this just shows you how complex the problem is. First of all, we should point out that race is a very difficult thing to define because racial boundaries aren't tight, right? So when you talk about racial differences in IQ, you're faced with the thorny problem of defining race. And that's a big problem from a scientific perspective. But we'll leave that aside. And I wrote an article this week. Somebody stood up at one point in one of my talks, and Vice, bless their hearts, took this particular question and used it as an indication of the quality of the people who are my so-called followers. And by the way, the quality of my so-called followers is pretty damn high, and you can find that out quite rapidly just by looking at the YouTube comments, which are head and shoulders above the standard set of YouTube comments, I can tell you that. So someone asked me about the Jewish question, right? And the implication, it was actually someone Jewish, and the implication was that Jews are overrepresented in positions of authority and power. And I had just spoken for like an hour and a half, and you know, this guy had an axe to grind, and I thought, there's no goddamn way I'm getting into this at the moment. And so I said I can't answer that question. But that's not a very good answer. So I wrote a blog post this week, and I said, look, here's the situation. All right. Jews are overrepresented in positions of power and authority. But then let's open our eyes a little bit, eh? And think for like 2 or 3 seconds and think, hey, guess what? They're also overrepresented in positions of competence. And it's not like we have more geniuses than we know what to do with. And if the Jews happen to be producing more of them, which they are, by the way, then that's a pretty good thing for the rest of us. So let's not confuse competence with power and authority, even though that's a favorite trick of the radical leftists, who always fail to make that distinction. Well, why does this overrepresentation occur? Because it does. There's also overrepresentation in political movements, including radical political movements. Okay, why? Well, answer 1, Jewish conspiracy. Okay, that's not a very good answer. We've used that answer before. All right, but do we have an alternative? Well, here's an alternative. The average Ashkenazi IQ is somewhere between 110 and 115, which is about 1 standard deviation above the population average. And so what that means is that the average Ashkenazi / European Jew has an IQ that's higher than 85% of the population. That's a lot higher. Now, that doesn't make that much difference in the middle of the distribution, okay? But geniuses don't exist at the middle of the distribution. They exist at the tails of the distribution. And you don't need much of a move at the mean to produce walloping differences at the tails. And the tails are important because a lot of where we draw exceptional people from the exceptions, right? So here's another example of the same thing. Most engineers are male. Why? Because men are more interested in things and women are more interested in people. And you might say, well, that's sociocultural. It's like, no, it's not. And we know that because if you stack up countries by their egalitarian social policies, which you can do quite effectively, and then you look at the overrepresentation of men in STEM fields, the overrepresentation increases as the countries become more egalitarian. So it's not sociocultural. Okay, now men aren't that much more interested in things than women. It's 1 standard deviation, which is about the same difference, by the way, between the population norm and the Ashkenazi Jews. But if you're looking at the 1 person in 20 or the 1 person in 50 who's hyper interested in things and thus likely to become an engineer, then most of them are men. Here's another example of the same thing. Men are more aggressive than women. Now, you might ask, how much? And the answer to that is, best place to look at that is in Sweden, where the egalitarian policies have been laid out for a long period of time, and you can get a more direct inference about biology. If you took a random man and a random woman out of the population, and you had to bet on who was more aggressive, and you bet on the man, you'd be right 60% of the time. So that's not that much, right? It deviates from 50-50, but it's not like 90-10, it's 60-40. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, we got a tail problem here again. Let's say that now you decide to go out onto the extremes of aggression and you identify the most aggressive 1 in 100 persons. They're all men. Guess who's in prison? Those people. That's why most of the people in prison are men. And so this is elementary. Part of the problem in our society is that we don't understand statistics. We don't understand that you can have relatively small differences at the population level that produce walloping consequences at the tails of the distribution. Okay, so back to IQ. One final thing to say about IQ. The ethnic differences are difficult to dispense with. It's not easy to make them go away. You can say, well, the tests aren't culture fair. Well, here's a test of that. So imagine you test group A with an IQ test and you test group B with an IQ test, and then you look at their actual performance in whatever you're predicting. If the test was biased against ethnic group A, then it would underpredict their performance, and that doesn't happen. Now you could say, well, there's systemic bias in the performance measures and the potential measures, and that's a possibility. All right. Now, one other thing about that. There's a real danger in the ethnicity IQ debate, and the danger is that we confuse intelligence with value, or that we confuse intelligence with human value. That's a better way of thinking about it. And one of the things that we're going to have to understand here is that that's a mistake, is that being more intelligent doesn't make you a better person. That's not the case. It makes you more useful for complex cognitive operations, but you can be pretty damn horrific as a genius son of a bitch, right? It's morally neutral, and we also know that from the psychometric data, by the way. There doesn't seem to be any relationship whatsoever between intelligence and virtue. And so if it does turn out that nature and the fates do not align with our egalitarian presuppositions, which is highly probable, we shouldn't therefore make the mistake of assuming that if group A or person A is lower on one of these attributes than group B or person B, that is somehow reflective of their intrinsic value as human beings. That's a big mistake. I don't have anything else to say about that.
Okay, so I had 3 more questions, and so maybe slightly shorter answers to these 3, like maybe around.
Well, hopefully they're simpler questions.
You know, average 5 minutes,
okay,
maybe,
okay.
And then we will open it up. So, another taboo is to celebrate European culture. Multiculturalists get pretty unhappy when Europeans start expressing pride in their culture or heritage. Many, especially on the left, do not draw much of a distinction, at least in practice, between European pride and white supremacy. You care about freedom of the individual's freedom to think, to speak, to associate, in short, to act as he sees fit without external compulsion, as long as he doesn't infringe on the similar liberties of others. Professor Ricardo Duchesne, a historical sociologist and professor at the University of New Brunswick, argues that, quote, individualism is a unique attribute of European peoples. Quote, it has been exported to some degree to other nations, but in my view, it is not something that comes to them naturally. So, he continues, quote, you can't play the game of we're all individuals. We have to affirm and be proud of our ethnic identity and heritage to preserve the West's curious individualism. If Europeans become minorities in the West, he argues, the founding idea of the West, that no entity, not an individual, not a community, not the state, can justly deprive an individual of life, liberty, or property by force, no matter what the individual's race, class, or religion. I wouldn't be surprised if Duchesne, when he made this statement, had you in mind.
Look, the medieval Europeans identified 7 deadly sins for a reason. And one of them was pride. It's like, let's make the presumption. I do believe that for reasons that aren't obvious, that the West has got some things right. We've got the sovereignty of the individual right. That's the most fundamental thing we've got right. We've articulated that, I think, in a remarkable way, not only theologically, philosophically, in our body of laws, in our societies. And one of the consequences of that, as it's had its effect on the rest of the world, is that everyone is getting richer quite fast. And that's a really good thing. Okay, having said that, it's like, am I proud of that? It's like, I didn't do that. What the hell? Pride. What's that? That's not the right response. How about Now, in order to act, you can't act without a hierarchy of value, which I tortured the other poor questioner about. You can't act without a hierarchy of values, because you can't act unless you think one thing is better than another. Because why would you act otherwise? So that means that you're embedded within a hierarchy of values, whether you know it or not, or maybe multiple fragmentary and competing hierarchies of value, which is all the worse for you, by the way, because it just makes you very confused. That hierarchy of values has an axiomatic, it's based on axioms, and the probability that you understand them is very low, because generally people don't understand their axioms. But that axiomatic system is essentially your religious system. And there's no way out of that, as far as I can tell. And you can say, well, it isn't predicated on conscious belief in a transcendent deity. It's like, okay, have it your way. But, you know, most people in this room act out a Judeo-Christian ethic. And not only do they act it out, if they're treated in a manner that's not commensurate with that ethic, they get very, very, very annoyed. So, for example, if I fail to treat you as if you're an embodiment of a divine fragment, let's say, that's characterized by the ability to make free choice and to determine your own destiny in some sense, or if I fail to treat you as if you're a valued contributing member of the polity as a sovereign individual, then you'll find that very offensive and become angry. It's like, okay, then that's what you believe. Well, if I ask you if you believe any of that, well, that's a whole different story. You might give me some radical leftist nonsense, but that doesn't take away from what you've that doesn't take away from the fundamentals of your action.
As one final thing, so when you and, say, Sam Harris argue about religion, you're arguing about fundamentally different things, it sounds like. His conception of what is religious is very different from yours.
Yeah, well, he tends to think of religious thought the same way that a smart 13-year-old atheist thinks about a fundamentalist Christian. It's like, yeah, okay, you're just not getting to the heart of the matter. You know, and I just finished reading all of Sam's books in the last couple of weeks. And as far as I'm concerned, he doesn't ever get to the bottom of the issue. He doesn't address the fundamental thinkers. There are some profound thinkers. Dostoevsky's one, Tolstoy, Nietzsche, Jung. It's like they're completely absent from, and the same with Dawkins. It's completely absent. All that conceptualization is completely absent from their corpus of works. They don't even have an understanding for the psychological utility of religion. And it's a big problem. You know, you don't get to be an atheist when the people you attack are like naive fundamentalists. And I have some sympathy for the naive fundamentalists. It's like what they're basically saying is something like this. Look, we have an ethos that's valuable. You scientist types are casually dismantling it. What the hell are we supposed to do? Well, the fundamentalists don't know what to do about that, so they say, well, creationism is science. It's like, well, no, it's not. But that doesn't mean that they don't have a point. Their point is there's something valuable here. It's like, don't break it casually. What are you going to replace it with? The new atheists wish that everybody becomes rational. It's like, yeah, sure, that's going to happen.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Peterson. I'm a student of religious studies, and currently I'm writing an honors thesis on religious imagery in an Indo-Persian literary genre. There's a poet-philosopher who said the following, which I think you'll like, who, by the way, was a huge fan of Goethe. He said that in addressing God, he calls him the hidden reality, and he asks the hidden reality to reveal itself, but using the robe of metaphor, because he thinks that metaphor is the only way, stories are the only way that human beings can comprehend, you know, the hidden reality. I know you've written a lot, you speak a lot about religious stories. I just wanted to ask you, although it may be a very broad question, what is the place of the religious in stories? And
religious is something like the grammatical structure of stories. Like if you go down and you look at what makes a story, that's religious. Yeah, it's not a story otherwise. Like a story is a particular sort of thing. Like in its simplest sense, a story is an account of how to get from point A to point B. It's like a map. But there's a value structure inherent in that, obviously, because otherwise you wouldn't go from point A to point B. So just to make the map means to adopt a value structure. But the story is actually more complicated than that, because as you move from point A to point B, processes of radical transformation are often necessary. And the deep stories about the processes of radical transformation that occur as you move from point A to B are basically, they're indistinguishable from religious stories. Now, I think the reason they tend to become religious, let's say, is because it has something to do with the gap between the finite and comprehensible and the infinite and incomprehensible. It's like we live in the finite and comprehensible, but we're surrounded by the infinite and incomprehensible, and there has to be a border between those, of some, like a mediating border. That's poetry and art. That's narrative. That's religion. And it's that strange metaphorical reality, let's say, that's not factual, and it's not comprehensible, but that's not infinitely incomprehensible either. It's a bridge between the two. So, and as you move closer to the infinite and incomprehensible across that bridge, you get farther and farther away from what you understand, right? But how could it be otherwise, given that you're finite, you are a finite being, surrounded by infinite, what's infinite and incomprehensible.
And that was his critique of the strict rationalists, that they can't, that it's hard for them to make this, that's where poets come in, and that's where artists come in. Yeah.
Exactly. Well, and I learned a lot of this from Jung, because Jung's idea was that rationality is embedded in a dream. Like there's the infinite unknowable, and then there's the dream. And then inside the dream is the rational domain. And I believe that to be the case. Why else would we dream? We have to dream. If we don't dream, we go insane. It doesn't take very long. And so there's an element of poetic conceptualization that grounds us, and it has to be taken seriously. You know, the rational critics of dreams think about them as random neural activity. It's like there's nothing, when you look at a TV screen that's not on a channel, that's random. When you dream something complex and sophisticated, that's not random. So, yeah, so the metaphor surrounds us, let's say. And we can critique it rationally and we can undermine it, but there's real danger in that. So,
please keep your question short, so we can get through as many as we can in this hour. I'm going to take one question from here, then take one on the other end.
I think we have a right side of the room bias happening. Kind of figures, I guess.
Take one.
Hi, Professor. Yeah, thank you for your talk. I'd like to find out from you, what's your view of institutional racism? Is it a thing, or is it some other radical leftist agenda?
Say, I didn't quite catch the first part of that.
What's your view of institutional racism, or systematic racism, as some people may call it?
Institutional system.
Yes.
Yeah.
Is it a thing? Is it an actual thing, or is it some other agenda that you might attribute to radical leftists?
It's a multivariate problem, right? Like no society is without its biases and prejudices, and some of them get built into the systems themselves. And so when you look at unequal outcomes and you're trying to discover why those unequal outcomes exist, if you have any sense, then you do a multivariate analysis and you put in prejudice and discrimination as one of the factors. One of the factors. One of many, many factors. And what the problem with the radical leftists is that they take the fact that societal structures are tyrannical to some degree and arbitrary, which of course they are because they're imperfect, and then they obliterate the rest of the complexity with that claim. So there's lots of reasons for inequality. Systemic bias is one of them. It's an open question to what degree systemic bias plays in the inequality problem, let's say. But it's something that we could hypothetically address with a certain degree of detachment and intelligence. So no system is perfect. Not, and certainly not ours. Reasonable? Reasonable answer? Okay, that's wise.
All right, so I think it's safe to say you're a fervent critic of postmodernism, and there are times where I don't think you quite give it a fair shake. And I'm no fan of, a good amount of the literature or the theory, but if you could point to one or two of the French theorists and some of their pieces, whether it's their literature or their theory, you could point to that's culpable for this sort of cultural rot that you charge postmodernism with causing, who would it be? What would it be?
I would say Foucault and Derrida. Lacan, I would also blame if I could understand him, but I don't actually think he is understandable, so I can't blame him. So, and I've done my best to read Lacan, and I think the reason I can't read it is because it doesn't make any sense. So, because I've read some very difficult things and I could understand them. So, Foucault, I think, is a tin pot genius. I read Madness and Civilization, for example. It just seems to me to be self-evident. Psychiatric diagnostic categories are in part social constructions. It's like, great. We've known that since like 1960. It's just not that big a revelation. And Derrida, well, he's a trickster, and his critique of the West as phallogocentric is dead on point. Male-dominated, that's his theory, and logocentric. Well, he thinks that's a problem. Well, I don't think it's a problem. So, and I think as well, it isn't even that, and I understand the postmodernist viewpoint. Like, look, it is the case that a finite set of entities is subject to an infinite number of interpretations. Okay, that's postmodernism in a nutshell. The AI guys figured that out in from 1960 to 1992. It took them that long to wade through that fundamental technical problem, a real problem. The problem of perception, for example. It's been very hard to solve the AI problem of perception because there are a lot of ways to look at the world. Like, the objects aren't just there in any simple sense. So, okay, there's an infinite number of interpretations. No problem. There's not an infinite number of viable interpretations. Okay, that's a big problem. Okay, and a little bit of thinking through that would have gone a long ways for the postmodernists. So that's number one. And then, what's the other one? Oh yes, and then the other problem is, okay, there's an infinite number of interpretations. We won't make anyone canonical. All right, well then how the hell are you going to act? Because you have to make a value system canonical if you're going to act. Oh, well, we didn't solve that problem. How about we just slip Marxism in underneath the carpet and not notice the problem? Then that gives us something to do. It's like, people come out and criticize me and say, Dr. Peterson doesn't understand that postmodernism and Marxism are incommensurate. It's like, yeah, actually, I do understand that. But the postmodern neo-Marxists don't seem to understand that. So how can you be a postmodernist and a Marxist at the same time? Well, the answer to that is actually to be found in the historical data. The postmodernist types, like Foucault and Derrida, were Marxists before they became postmodernists. And the postmodern overlay on the Marxism was, as far as I can tell, mostly a cover story for going about the same old murderous idiocy under a new guise. So,
do you think it's possible that there are, that there are lenses, like postmodern lenses, that we can view culture from under, that can at times be more powerful and useful than other lenses? Like, for example, Baudrillard, the idea of the simulacrum and the successive phases of the image. Joan Didion.
Baudrillard could at least think. Yeah. And I mean, you can't throw all the postmodernists into the same jug, right. But I would say it's still Derrida and Foucault have had the most pernicious effects.
Okay, so you would charge them with the worst of the worst.
Well,
opening up this can of worms that we haven't really refilled.
Well, the problem is they didn't deal with it seriously. It's like, you can't just say no meta-narrative. It's like, okay, how are we going to unite ourselves then? We're going to use multiculturalism. Well, that's really worked to produce a peaceful world, hasn't it? So you need a uniting narrative. If we didn't have a uniting narrative, we wouldn't all be sitting peacefully in this room. It's the uniting narrative that governs our behavior in this room. And look, here we are, all peaceful. It's like they're not dealing with the fundamental issues. And to slip Marxism back in as a backdoor route to having something to do with your life is intellectually and morally reprehensible.
Okay, thank you. Yep. Take one down here then.
How are you, sir? My name's Steve. I just wanted to ask you about this experience that I had after watching one of your lectures that really profoundly impacted me, and I was wondering if you could kind of help me out with understanding this. After watching your lecture on Jung and just talking about his life, you started talking about the Lion King and kind of connecting what the intro scene was in the Lion King and the idea of archetypes. And when I started to understand what you were saying, I had this unbelievable feeling, like in my stomach and my whole body. It was just this smack, like this very intense feeling.
It's a warning never to read Jung.
Yeah, well, I have. I started with Ion, so that's
maybe
not a good idea. So
no.
Yeah. It was just this powerful feeling, and I got so emotional, and thinking up how to articulate this question to you a few minutes ago, I was just getting so emotional. It just seems like, it scared the hell out of me, that feeling. But it was also a really meaningful, so valuable, amazing feeling. And I thought, it's kind of like what God is, or yeah, it was just so. And I usually get that feeling too of after listening to like a band like the Cro-Mags or Black Flag or some hardcore band, or that music is so important to me like that. And
it's levels of reality stacking on top of each other.
And the question that just made me so emotional too is like, what could my life be? And that was something that I just found myself asking myself, just what. And I wonder if you could, give me some extra stuff on that, what that really was,
Yeah, well, you gotta be very careful when you're doing something like reading Jung, because he'll reorganize your cognitive structures, and there's deaths and rebirths that go along with that. What you're trying to do in part is to, in a sense, you're trying to bring what you do and how you imagine yourself and how you articulate yourself into alignment. So those three things are the same. It's very hard because there's more to you in your action than there is in your articulation, and there's more to you in your action than there is in your imagination. And so partly what you're experiencing is an expanded sense of self and possibility. And you might think, well, that's a wonderful thing, but it's also a very daunting thing. And it can be a very dangerous thing. When I was dealing with all of this material, when I was writing my first book, I had to abandon a lot of the things that I was doing that were bad habits, because it was so stressful to move through these systems of ideas that I couldn't afford any additional mental energy being wasted on things I was doing that weren't together. So.
Hi, Dr. Peterson. So on February 13th, you got into a prolonged debate on Twitter with a quote bot, a Slavoj Žižek quote bot, and then again on March 9th.
With a quote bot?
Yeah, it was a quote bot.
No, that wasn't very bright, was it?
No, and then again on March 9th, actually, with Noam Chomsky quote bot. And so I want to ask you, as like the leading.
Because I'm old and don't understand technology.
Yeah. So how important do you think it is to like debate these intellectuals, and do you think that you won?
Oh God, I always hesitate to claim victory. Like to escape without abject defeat is a pretty good ambition. So, and plus I think it's rather improbable that I would win a debate with a quote bot.
So some people thought it was pretty close.
Yeah. Twitter is a weird platform.
It's complicated. Yeah.
It is a complicated platform, and I've modified my approach to Twitter in the last month and a half, I would say. I've been trying to selectively retweet information. I polled a bunch of people and asked them if they knew of credible Twitter sources that were producing valid, good news. And I found a bunch of sites that were doing that and then winnowed them down. I really like humanprogress.org, which has done a lovely job of detailing. Well, they had a great tweet the other day I really loved. It was a mock-up of a New York Times cover, and it said 127,000 people lifted out of abject poverty today, in like large type. And then the tweet was, we could have run this every single day for the last 20 years. It's like, you know, because some of you know, but perhaps some of you don't, that between the year 2000 and 2012, and this hasn't stopped yet, the number of people in abject poverty in the world fell by half. Right? It was the most rapid period of economic development ever in the history of the world. And there's lots of things like that happening. There's several 100,000 people a day being hooked to the power grid, which is a big deal. For those of you who have power might also appreciate that. Infant mortality has been plummeting. You know, we're going to plateau in terms of population at about 9 billion, and it's going to level off and decline pretty rapidly after that. People are getting access to fresh water in record numbers. Like, there's so many good things happening that it's not even funny, and that are a real cause for celebration. And so I've been trying to tilt what I've been distributing more in that direction. And I've also put a buffer between me and my use of Twitter, so because it does reward an impulsivity that isn't always, let's say my impulsivity, that isn't always in anyone's best interest. I made an agreement with my son because he's been watching, I have lots of people watching what I'm doing and trying to keep me under some degree of control, let's say. And his comment was that if it was serious enough to engage in Twitter combat about, it was serious enough to write a blog post about. And so I've kind of made this rule, which is I'm not going to comment on anything on Twitter in that sort of manner unless I feel that writing about it at some length is justifiable. And so I started doing that this week. I wrote 3 blog posts, and that seems to have gone pretty well. So I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, thank you.
Yep.
Kind of go on a different topic. I have a personality psychology question.
Okay.
So when I did the Understand Myself quiz, I was very surprised to find out that I was on the bottom 2 percentile for conscientiousness, which I thought was...
Are you high in openness?
Yes.
You're an entrepreneurial type. You're going to need to partner with someone who's disciplined. Well, that's exactly... See, there seems to be a real tension between openness and especially orderliness. You know, because open people... Well, they think laterally and they blow boxes apart, and they tend to make a mess when they're transforming things, and they're all over the place. And they have to be, because otherwise they wouldn't be open. But it's hard to do that and also be orderly and conscientious. And so, and corporations suffer from this tension all the time, right? Because they're started by open people, but when they get going and get algorithmized, they're run by conscientious people. But then the conscientious people can only go down one track, and if the environment transforms, the whole company disappears. So I would say, you take a look at the conscientiousness score. You see if you can figure out how to discipline yourself a bit more, and see if you can figure out how to schedule your time. Not like a prison, but like a structured set of opportunities. And then you understand that in order to be successful in life, likely in the medium to long run, you're going to have to find someone, could be someone close to you, or it could be business partners or whatever, that fill in that missing conscientiousness gap.
Mm-hmm.
So,
yeah, I guess the part B was my boyfriend, we've been together for a very long time and we're not that old, is also very high in neuroticism, and I feel that's where like our conflict comes. And as far as long term, what are some things that, you know, lowly conscientious and highly neurotic... We'll look into that.
Yeah, well, I mean, the simple, I can only, high levels of neuroticism are problematic in a relationship. It's probably why 75% of divorces are initiated by women, because women are higher in neuroticism than men. And I think the reason for that is that they have to be more sensitive to infant distress, and so that makes them more sensitive to distress in general. Now, I don't know that for sure. It's a supposition. But high levels of neuroticism do tend to make a relationship volatile and to put a fair bit of negative emotion into it. Now the question is what the source of the high level of neuroticism is. It might be purely temperamental, but it also might be indicative of an underlying anxiety disorder or depression or a physiological problem, because they can manifest themselves in high levels of negative emotion. And so there's always the possibility of doing something about that. What I usually tell my clients who are high in neuroticism is 2 simple things. Number 1, get up at the same time in the morning, okay, because that helps stabilize your circadian rhythms. Number 2, eat a large meal before you stress yourself in the morning, and mostly protein and fat based. Because if you're high in neuroticism and you stress yourself before you eat, you dysregulate your emotional reaction systems essentially, and you can't re-regulate them till you sleep again. So other than that, goodwill and understanding is about what you've got. Yeah.
How you doing tonight, Dr. Peterson?
Not too bad. Pretty good questions so
Good.
far. A little on the brutal side, I might say, but
I'm incredibly nervous to talk in front of you because you've got to be one of the most formidable people that I've ever heard of or ever listened to or ever seen. So my question is, again, you're one of the best communicators that I've ever listened to. If I could be half as good at you or at communicating as you are, I would be set. How can I teach myself to do that?
Practice. You know, really, like, well, there's a couple of things. It helps to read a lot. It really helps to write. So if you want to make yourself articulate, which is a very good idea, then not only should you read, but you should write down what you think. And if you can do that a little bit every day, 15 minutes, maybe you could steal 15 minutes and do it every day. But if you do that for 10 years, you really straighten out your thinking. If you're going to speak effectively, you have to know way more than you're talking about, you know. So this is often difficult for beginning lecturers at university because they'll do a lecture on a topic, but they only know as much as they're saying in the lecture. And they get kind of stuck to their notes because of it. But you want to know 10 times as much as you are saying in the lecture, and then you can specify a stepping path through it and elaborate with the other things that you know. But to do that, you have to do a lot of reading. But you also have to do a lot of reading because that's where the synthesizing comes. So that's on the input side. And then on the output side, well, there's some tricks, techniques, let's say, is like if you're speaking in front of a group, you are not delivering a talk to a group. That's not what you're doing. The talk isn't a packaged thing that you present to a group. There isn't a group. There's a bunch of individuals, and you talk to them. So when I talk to a group, I always talk to people one at a time. And that makes it easier too, because you know how to talk to a person. It's like, can you talk to 1,000 people? Well, probably